For the murder of a colonial citizen, Schoolmaster Sable, Pedro Wakao will be dragged around the execution site by horse, then his hands will be chopped off and his head crushed with a big hammer. Louis Mercier, you will be hanged by the neck until dead. The slave known as Tula of the Knip plantation will be put on 2 crossed poles, and all of his bones should be broken from the feet up. His face will be burned, then his head cut off and placed on a stake.
Hello. Welcome back. Thank you for coming back, those of you who have come back. And sit back, relax while I start part 2 of Incident of a Slave Girl. Linda Brent's mother's mistress was the daughter of my grandmother's mistress. She was the foster sister of my mother. They were both nourished at my grandmother's breast. In fact, my mother had been weaned at 3 months old that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. You know what bothers me about this? You know, when I see videos or read things about how black women slaves breastfed these white women's children. And then these white women children grew up to be thorns and hateful monsters to these black women or the offspring. It's like, you only are here. You are only alive because of a black woman's milk. Then you had the audacity to grow your ass up and be hateful and malicious to the people who look like the woman that fed your ass. She could have refused to feed you. You know, a lot of these white women were sickly and had a lot of aborted a lot of their children and had a lot of physical ailments and issues that kept them from being able to breastfeed their children, or they were sickly and weak and couldn't take care of their children, and some of them just didn't want any children, but they felt it was the Christian thing to do, to bring children in this world, and secretly despised them and just secretly just hated them. I know I said despise and hate the same thing, but just didn't want to be mothers, couldn't stand the husbands they were married to. And you had this black slave woman that was required to take care of this white woman's offspring. Think about the most brutal, most hateful, racist white man and woman. And then think about the black woman that had to feed that bastard. Those bastards. Think about it. These hateful white men and women, you ate from the breast of a woman you despise. You grew up to despise. Do you see the mentality of these people? You cannot tell me that something is not right with these people. Something is wrong. That someone fed you from their body, kept your ass alive because your mama couldn't do it, and then you grew up to hate them. A dog wouldn't even be that evil. A dog, if you helped a dog and kept them alive and protected them, they'll be loyal to you for the rest of their lives. But you have people who are called human beings that have been helped by people who look like me. And then you turn around and you're worse than a dog and you hate them. Let's continue. They played together as children, and when they became women, Linda's mother was a most faithful servant to her whiter foster sister. On her deathbed, her mistress promised that her children should never suffer for anything, and during her lifetime, she kept her word. Linda Brent's mother was highly respected even after death. Her mother was a slave in name, but in nature was noble and womanly. When her mother died, Linda was troubled with thoughts, wondering what should become of her and her little brother. They were sent to live with her mother's mistress. She insisted that it was a happy home. Linda did not experience the typical harshness or hardships that slaves were destined to go through. She said her mistress was so kind. Linda was always glad to do her mistress's bidding. She sat by her mistress' side for hours, sewing diligently with a heart as free from care as that of any free-born white child. Those were happy days, too happy to last. The slave child had no thought for the morrow. But there came that blight that every human being born to be a chattel endured. The mistress died when Linda was 12 years old. She said she loved this woman as her own mother. Unfortunately, the mistress died and Linda was sent to spend a week with her grandmother. During this time, Linda thought of her future. Day and night, she pondered her fate. She knew she would never find another mistress as kind as the one who was gone. Before Linda's mother died, she was promised by the mistress that her children would never suffer for anything. Linda hoped that promise included her freedom. But of course, that would have been too much like right. As you will find that no matter how kind enslavers appeared to treat slaves, if their kindness wasn't demonstrated by actions, setting them free and helping them or giving them the tools to live a meaningful life, their words were insincere. Another form of sadistic behavior by immoral people. On the account of Linda's mother's faithful service to Linda's now mistress, it was assumed by many, including Linda's friends, that the mistress would have willed her to be free. At last, we all know that the memory of a faithful slave does not avail much to save her children from the auction block. After a period of suspense, the will of her mistress was read, and everyone learned that she had bequeathed Linda to her sister's 5-year-old daughter. Linda's hope was dashed. On that day, she learned the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Whoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. That scripture did not apply to Linda, so she thought. It became crystal clear to her that regardless of how much she thought she was loved and cared about by her mistress, Linda was only a slave. Loving thy neighbor as you love yourself did not apply to a slave. Yes, she could not forsake the love she still held near and dear in her heart for her deceased mistress, and the memories of a happy childhood didn't escape her. Those thoughts would eventually help ease the bitterness that came with the injustice of being transferred to another to carry on the degradation of being a chattel. Even though she bared mixed feelings for her departed mistress, she was thankful that she was taught to read and spell. For that privilege, which so rarely falls to many slaves, Linda blessed her memory. At the mistress's death, all 5 of her slaves were distributed among her relatives. All 5 of the slaves were Linda's grandmother's children, who shared the same milk that nourished her mother's children. Regardless of Linda's grandmother's long and faithful service to her owners, not one of her children escaped the auction block. These God-breathing machines are no more in the sight of their masters than the cotton they plant or the horses they tend. The sister of Linda's mistress who died married the neighborhood's physician, Dr. Flint. Linda was the property of their little daughter, and Williams, Linda's brother, was purchased by the same family. One day when Linda and William's father and his mistress both called William at the same time, he hesitated, perplexed, not knowing which to answer first. He chose to respond to the mistress. When their father chastised him for this act of disloyalty and disrespect, William said, "You both called me. I didn't know which I ought to go to first." "You are my child," replied the father. "And when I call you, you should come immediately if you have to pass through fire and water." Poor Willie. was now to learn his first lesson of obedience to a master. When Linda and her brother Williams entered their new home, it was the very opposite of what they were accustomed to. They were met with cold looks, cold words, and cold treatment. Linda had been there nearly a year when her dear friend died. She had gone to her friend's funeral only to be hit with more debilitating news about a loved one on the same day.
"Come with me, Linda,"
the grandmother said. Her grandmother's tone was telling. She knew something happened that she was not prepared for.
"My child,"
grandmother said,
"your father is dead."
Harriet was stunned, silent. His death was so sudden. There was no talk of her father being ill. Her heart was heavy. She rebelled against God, who she blamed for taking her mother, father, mistress, and her friend. After learning of the heartbreaking news and receiving comfort from her grandmother, Linda returned to her masters. Due to her father dying, she thought she should be allowed to go to her father's house the next morning. Instead, Linda was ordered to go for flowers, decorate the house for an evening party. Linda spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into festoons while the dead body of her father lied a mile away. Her enslavers could not care any less about the mental anguish the death of her father caused. He was merely a piece of property. Moreover, they thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel that they were human beings. This was blasphemous doctrine for a slave to teach and dangerous to the masters. Little attention was paid to the slaves' meals in Dr. Flint's house. Slaves were left to their own clever devices when it came to catching a bit of food. Linda fortunately was never concerned about eating. While going on various errands, she would pass by her grandma's house where there was always food to spare. Of course, that blessing wasn't met with threats of punishment if she stopped at her grandmother's house. No threat would ever stop her from receiving love and food from her grandmother. Her grandmother was standing at the gate with food in hand, waiting for her beloved granddaughter to walk past. Miss Flint, like many white Southern women, was totally deficient of energy. She had no strength to tend to household affairs, but her nerves were strong when it came to sitting down in an easy chair and watching a woman whipped till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. Miss Flint was a member of the church, but partaking the Lord's Supper did not seem to put her in a Christian frame of mind. If dinner was not served at the exact time that particular Sunday, she would station herself in the kitchen and wait till it was dished. Then she would spit in all the kettles and pans that had been used for cooking. She did this to prevent the cook and her children from scraping out any drizzle of gravy and any other scrapping.
That was disgusting. And these are the ones who claim that slavery was a good thing. They taught people who look like me to be civilized. Isn't that what they say? But a civilized person would spit in a damn pan just to keep a person who cooked for your gritty ass from just getting a little bit of food. You better be glad I wasn't born during that time. I mean, you thought Nat Turner was bad.
The slaves could not... God. Let me get back on track. The slaves could get nothing to eat except for what she chose for them. Provisions were weighed out by the pound and ounce 3 times a day. She gave them no chance to eat wheat bread from her flour. She knew how much biscuits a quarter of flour would make and exactly what size they ought to be.
Why you didn't get your ass up and go in there and cook? If you had such a problem, this is why I say it's masochistic, sadistic. If you had a problem with slaves eating your food, why you didn't get your ass up and go cook? Like, look, that's right. I don't need. Y'all can tend to cleaning and sweeping and putting up clothes and washing them and all that. But I will cook food for me and my family. You ain't got to worry about putting your hands on my ingredients and my dishes. I got it. I might let you wash my dishes, but you ain't got to cook nothing for me. Why didn't you get their asses up and cook? If you had a problem with that's what I say, that the torture is like they was ingrained in them to torture people. Oh, God.
Dr. Flint took pleasure in fine foods and drink. He took extreme delight in his food being properly prepared.
It takes me some time to get my mind back on where it needs to be so I can read this. Because when I read ludicrous things and sickening, barbaric, cold-hearted things like that, it just takes me somewhere. God, help me get back on track. Let me start over this paragraph I began reading.
Dr. Flint took pleasure in fine foods and drink. He took extreme delight in his food being properly prepared. The cook never sent a dinner to his table without fear and trembling, for if there happened to be a dish not to his liking, he would either order her to be whipped or compel her to eat every mouthful of it in his presence. The poor hungry creature might not have objected to eating it, but she did object to having her master cram it down her throat till she choked. The Flint family had a pet dog that was a nuisance. The cook was ordered to make the dog some Indian mush that he refused to eat. The dog's head was held over the food, the saliva dripping from its mouth into the basin. He died a few minutes after. The cook was accused of not cooking the food correctly. Dr. Flint sent for the cook. He forced her to eat the food that the dog refused to eat, which was covered with the dead dog's saliva. He thought the woman's stomach was stronger than the dog's, but her sufferings afterwards proved that he was mistaken. The poor woman endured many cruelties from her master and mistress. Sometimes she was locked up away from her nursing baby for a whole day and night. Linda had been in the family's house for only a week, and she witnessed horrible acts committed against the slave by Dr. Flint. One of the plantation slaves was brought to town by order of his master. It was near night when he arrived, and Dr. Flint ordered him to be taken to the workhouse and tied up to a pillar so that his feet were barely off the ground. The slave awaited his punishment until Dr. Flint was done with his tea. Linda never forgot that night. Never in her life had she heard hundreds of blows fall in succession on a human being. His groans and his "oh, pray don't, massa" rang in her ear for months afterwards. There were many speculations as to the cause of this terrible punishment. Some said master accused him of stealing corn. Others said the slave had a fight with his wife in the presence of the overseer. He accused his master of being the father of his wife's child. They were both black, and the child was very fair. The next morning, Linda went into the workhouse and saw the cowhide used to beat the slave still wet with blood and the boards covered with gore. The poor man lived and continued to fight with his wife. A few months after the horrendous beating, Dr. Flint handed them both over to a slave trader. When the mother was delivered into the trader's hands, she said,
"You promised to treat me well."
Dr. Flint replied,
"You have let your tongue run too far, damn you."
She had forgotten that it was a crime for a slave to tell who was the father of her child. The mistress was just as her husband, with a bit more cruelty in her veins. Linda witnessed a young slave girl dying soon after the birth of a nearly white child. In agony, she cried out,
"Oh Lord, come and take me."
Her mistress stood by, mocking her like a sadistic maniac.
"You suffer, do you?"
Mistress exclaimed.
"I am glad of it. You deserve it all and more too."
The girl's mother said,
"The baby is dead, thank God, and I hope my poor child will soon be in heaven too." "Heaven,"
retorted the mistress.
"There is no such place for the like of her and her bastard."
The poor mother turned away sobbing. Her dying daughter called her feebly, and as she bent over her, I heard her say,
"Don't grieve so, mother. God knows all about it, and he will have mercy upon me."
Her sufferings afterwards became so intense that her mistress felt unable to stay. But when she left the room, the scornful smile was still on her lips. 7 children called her mother. The poor black woman had but the one child whose eyes she saw closing to death. while she thanked God for taking her away from the greater bitterness of life.
You know, that gotta be sad for a mother to wish and want her child to be dead out of mercy.
Dr. Flint owned a fine residence in town, several farms, and about 50 slaves, besides hiring a number by the year. Hiring day at the South takes place on the 1st of January, and on the 22nd, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters. On the farm, they worked until the corn and cotton are laid. They then had 2 holidays. Some masters give them a good dinner under the trees. This over, they work until Christmas. If they behave as good slaves, giving their masters no issue, they are given 4 or 5 holidays, whichever the master or overseer may think is proper. Then comes New Year's Eve. Slaves gather together with their little to nothing possessions, waiting anxiously for the next day. At the appointed hour, the grounds were covered with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doomed pronounced. The slave is sure to know who is the most humane or cruel master within 40 miles of him. It is easy to find out on that day who clothes and feeds his slaves well, for he is surrounded by a crowd begging,
"Please, massa, hire me this year. I will work very hard, massa."
If a slave is unwilling to go with his new master, he is whipped or locked up in jail until he consents to go and promises not to run away during the year.
If slavery was that good, why did you had to force people to do the work or put them up in chains if they refuse to do it? Oh, well, that's easy. They had to be forced because, darn it, everybody knows that the niggers is lazy. Yeah, no, we know you're lazy, but I don't know about a slave being lazy, because if that was the case, a lot wouldn't have been built in this country that your white hands didn't build.
Let's continue. Should he have a chance to change his mind, thinking it's justifiable to violate an extorted promise?
What kind of promise is that? Either work, go to jail, or get killed. What kind of promise is that? Or be murdered?
Woe unto him if he is caught. The whip is used till the blood flows at his feet, and his stiffened limbs are put in chains to be dragged in the field for days and days. Oh, you happy free women, contrast your New Year's Day with that of the poor bondwoman. With you it is a pleasant season, and the light of the day is blessed. Friendly wishes meet you wherever you go. Gifts are showered upon you. Even hearts that have been estranged from you soften at the season, and lips that have been silent echo back, I wish you a happy new year. Children bring their little offerings and raise their rosy lips from a caress. They are your own, and no hand but that of death can take them from you. But to the slave mother, New Year's Day comes laden with peculiar sorrows. She sits on her cold cabin floor watching the children who may all be torn from her the next morning. And often does she wish that she and they might die before the day dawns. She may be an ignorant creature, degraded by the system that has brutalized her from childhood, but she has a mother's instinct and is capable of feeling a mother's agony. On one of these sale days, Linda saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all of her children, sold them to a slave trader, and the mother was bought by a man in her own town. Before night, her children were all far away. She begged the trader to tell her where he intended to take them. This he refused to do. How could he, when he knew he would sell them one by one wherever he could command the highest price? I met that mother in the street, and her wild, haggard face lives today in my mind. She wrung her hands in anguish and exclaimed, "Gone, all gone. Why don't God kill me? I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are of daily, yea, of hourly occurrence. Slaveholders have a method peculiar to their institution of getting rid of old slaves whose lives have been worn out in their service. Linda knew of an old woman who faithfully served her master for 70 years. She had become almost helpless from hard labor and disease. Her owners moved to Alabama, and the old black woman was left to be sold to anybody who would give $20 for her. 20 funky ass dollars. Linda recalled the first time she was punished. It was in the month of February. Her grandmother bought her a new pair of shoes that were needed for the winter had come, bringing several inches of snow. When Linda walked through Mrs. Flint's room, the creaking of her new shoes grated the nerves of the mistress. She called Linda, demanding to know what was making such a horrid noise. Linda told her it was her new shoes. "Take them off," she said, "and if you put them on again, I'll throw them into the fire." Linda did as she was told. She was then sent on a long, distant errand, walking barefoot through the snow. She woke the next morning sick. Linda wondered if she died. Would the heartless mistress feel an ounce of remorse? You see what I say when I keep saying sadistic? Sadistic. It was like they could do whatever they wanted to living mankind, people who have flesh and blood on their bones. They could do whatever they wanted to them, just because. I want to be mean, evil, and wicked, and I just want to take out my sickness on these people that are forsaken. And they did it. Jesus, they did it. And so it begins what every female slave dreaded: the unwanted, perverted advancement of the male enslaver. During the first years of Linda's service to Dr. Flint's family, her master began to whisper foul words in her ear. The master's age and her being only 15, and the fear that what he tried to do would be reported to Linda's grandmother, kept the hound dog enslaver at bay. Oh, but he was a crafty man, resorting to many things to get what he wanted. Dr. Flint displayed two different personalities to his targeted victims: monstrous and syrupy sweet. Linda preferred the monstrous mode, although it left her trembling. He tried his hardest to corrupt the pure principles Linda's grandmother instilled. He plagued her young mind with unclean images such as only a vile monster could think of. She walked away with him filled with disgust and hatred. But he was her master, forced to live under the same roof with him, where she witnessed a man of 40 years her senior violating the most sacred commandments of nature. She was told that she was his property, subjected to his will in all things. Linda's soul revolted against the mean tyranny, but where could she turn to for protection? No matter whether the slave girl be as black as ebony or as fair as her mistress, in either case, there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death. All these are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men. What these people thought that those they call slaves were forsaken by God. Actually, those people who put them in chains are forsaken. And you know, like I've said many times, that the Bible was used as a weapon against people that were enslaved. It was used to keep them oppressed and bound mentally and physically, and it was used to make them hate the Word of God. And then you think about if they knew the Bible like they think they do, slaves weren't treated in the Bible. Slaves of the Bible weren't treated like that. They were actually treated like family members. sometimes better than a family member. And the enslaver would be kind to them. They would be living in nice places and just well taken care of, with respect, love, and kindness. The things that the majority of slaves endured during that wicked, dark time, that still has spilled over today, it was anything but godly. Anything but godly. And like I said, you can look at their actions today. Like these people who trying so desperately to prove that slavery wasn't as violent, wicked, and dark, and dirty, and freaky, and perverted, and sickening as it was. You can see the actions of the offsprings today. Those enslavers' offsprings, it's in their bloodline. Look how they act today. And you want us to sit here and foolishly believe that your ancestors weren't as sick as you are. You show us how sick and demented they are by your actions today. Let me continue. The mistress, who ought to protect the helpless victim, has no other feelings toward her but those of jealousy and rage. The degradation, the wrongs, the vices that grew out of slavery were more than could be described. Even the little child who is accustomed to wait on her mistress and her children will learn before she is 12 years old why it is that her mistress hates such and such a one among the slaves. Perhaps the child's own mother is among those hated ones. She listens to violent outbreaks of jealous passion and cannot help understanding what is the cause. She will become prematurely knowing in evil things. Soon she will learn to tremble when she hears her master's footfall. She will be compelled to realize that she is no longer a child. If God has bestowed beauty upon her, it will prove to be her greatest curse. The beauty that commands admiration in a white woman only brings much degradation to the female slave. I know that some are too much brutalized by slavery to feel the humiliation of their position. Dr. Flint met Linda at every turn, reminding her that she belonged to him and swearing by heaven and earth that she would be made to submit to him. Dr. Flint dogged her footsteps everywhere she went. Her naturally light heart became heavy with grief. The other slaves in the master's house noticed the change. She was pitied, but none dared to ask what was the cause. They had no need to inquire. They knew too well the guilty practices under that roof, and they were aware that to speak of them was an offense that never went unpunished. Linda needed someone to confide in. Her grandmother meant everything to her, but she feared her as well as loved her. And though she had been a slave, Dr. Flint was afraid of her. Dr. Flint dreaded Linda's grandmother's scorching rebukes. Her grandmother was a highly respected woman known by many. He did not want it to be known how vile he was in private. It was a good thing that Linda was not on an isolated plantation. Dr. Flint caused Linda severe sorrow and fear. There were two beautiful children playing together. One was a fair white child and the other was a slave, also her sister. When Linda saw them embracing each other and heard their joyous laughter, she turned sadly away, foreseeing the inevitable blight that will fall on the little slave's heart. Linda knew how soon her laughter would be changed to sighs. The white child grew up to be a fairer woman with a bright future. It was not so much the same for her slave sister. Although she was very beautiful, a bright future was not in store for her. She drank the cup of sin and shame and misery that her persecuted race are made to drink. I would 10 times rather that my child should be the half-starved paupers of Ireland than to be the most pampered among the slaves of America. I would rather drudge out my life on a cotton plantation till the grave opened to give me rest than to live with an unprincipled master and a jealous mistress. the felon's home in a penitentiary is preferable. He may repent and turn from the error of his ways and so find peace, but it is not so with a favorite slave. She is not allowed to have any pride of character. It is deemed a crime in her to wish to be virtuous. Miss Flint possessed the key to her husband's character before I was born. She might have used this knowledge to counsel and to screen the young and the innocent among her slaves, but for them, she had no sympathy. They were the objects of her constant suspicion and hatred. She watched her husband with unceasing vigilance, but he was very crafty at concealing his dark deeds. He invented ways of using so-called sign language to communicate with Linda that she ignored. Her feigned ignorance of what he tried to do was met with threats. Dr. Flint discovered ways to require Linda to be at his beck and call, only to assault her mind and ears with filthy, disgusting things. Sometimes Linda openly expressed contempt for what he said and did. Linda would be met with a violent outburst. She wondered why he did not strike her. Dr. Flint's behavior grew worse by the day. Out of desperation, Linda told him that she would tell her grandmother about his constant harassment. Linda was threatened with death if she made any complaint to her grandmother. And that, folks, concludes part 2. When I finish editing part 1, or when I complete editing part 1 and part 2, I will be back with part 3. Thanks again for your time and attention and support. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing. Have a good day. Take care. God bless you. Be safe. Thanks.